From the beautiful Missouri Ozarks, this is P.I.D. Radio. Welcome, I'm Derek Gilbert.
I am Sharon Gilbert, and today's episode is a look back at our very first interviews with a gentleman that we have admired for years and who left to be with Jesus yesterday.
Less than 24 hours ago, so this is still
very raw.
Yeah, many people still just finding out about this.
Yes. Yeah, the church lost a general yesterday.
The church really did. Not just a brilliant researcher, writer, dynamic public speaker, but a wonderful man.
Dr. Thomas Horn.
Yes.
Changed so many lives, changed so many paradigms, moved so much, theological cheese.
Yeah.
That he has put, here's the thing. We said this about the late Dr. Mike Heiser. It's true of Tom Horn as well, that both men lit thousands of torches worldwide, and we are now carrying those in their honor.
What impressed me about Tom, and this is also true of Mike, because we saw this with Mike and Drina and their children. We've seen it up close for the last 8 years here in the Ozarks, 8.5 years since coming to Missouri. Sometimes those who are really dynamic in the pulpit, who have really big ministries, will have, they divert energy that they should be spending on their family into their preaching, teaching, speaking, traveling, and so on. And that was not the case with Tom.
No, not at all. In fact, Tom always put family first.
Yeah, as did Mike. So we see the legacy that Tom is leaving in his children and his grandchildren, and the love and respect they have for him, as well as in the ministries that Tom, and I'll say this again about Mike, that they have launched. I would say if we had to choose, and there were many, many influences. I mean, the late Chuck Missler is another who was influential on us, but the two we interacted with most frequently, and I would say three being L.A. Marzulli.
Amen.
Mike, L.A., and Tom really changed the course of our lives.
That is so true. And you and I have been at P.I.D. Radio. We began our ministry on, if you want to call it the internet radio, podcasting back in March of 2005. So a long time. And it was in 2005 in September that we interviewed Dr. Tom Horn for the very first time. So we'd been listening to him online with Steve Quayle and others for a while, and finally got brave enough to send him a little email.
Yeah, and he was very gracious with his time, and
very.
You'll hear in the audio that we're going to feature this week the difference in the equipment that we were using 18 years ago versus what we are able to use today.
Yeah, Derek will do his best to get out hisses and things like that, but the fact is it was a string and bubblegum sort of setup.
Indeed it was. So back in September of 2005, our very first interview with Tom Horn.
We welcome to our guest line Tom Horn, the editor and publisher of Raiders News Update and the co-author with his wife Nita of The Ariman Gate, a new novel of the things that are to come. Tom, welcome to PID Radio.
Hey, thank you for inviting me on.
Tom, how are you doing?
We're doing good. Yeah, just staying busy.
Now, you're on the West Coast, Northwest Coast?
Yes,
Are you getting any of those little temblors that are hitting out there? The earthquake?
I haven't felt anything here. Of course, I live right in Sisters, and or right near Sisters, the Three Sisters Mountain up here. The side of it's been swelling. Well, for the last 2 or 3 years, it's made news recently. We're aware of it. And if you drive Highway 20 from like Portland or Salem, and you're coming towards Sisters, you pass mile after mile after mile of mountains of volcanic basalt. And so you're aware that at one point in times past, you didn't want to be here. there was a massive amount of volcanic activity at some time in the past here, and so it could be again. And I still remember the day when I was in McMinnville, Oregon, and somebody ran in my office and said Mount St. Helens just exploded, and I walked outside and looked at it, and it literally looked like a nuclear bomb had gone off.
Oh my goodness!
Just a huge rolling mushroom cloud, and then the next day, early in the morning, about 4 o'clock, I got up and I walked outside and I thought, is it foggy out here? What's going on? And then something all over the ground was slippery. And by the time the sun came out, I realized it was volcanic ash everywhere. So.
Oh, yeah.
So you're right there where there's all kinds of excitement.
Do you get a lot of UFOs out there? No, seriously, because supposedly they hang around volcanoes.
They hang around volcanoes, I guess. In addition to everything else, my wife and I, years ago, we were driving over a mountain here in Oregon, and I kept thinking that I was seeing a reflection on the glass on my window because something was a light, moving back and forth on my windshield real fast. This was the middle of the day, and as I'm driving, talking with her, I started focusing more intently on it, and I realized it was something up in the sky. And I pulled over to the side of the road, and her and I got out, and she stood there and watched it with me for several minutes. And I don't know what it was, but it certainly did not obey any laws of physics. It would literally travel hundreds of miles of the sky just in a flash, and do hard right angle turns and just things. And then finally, it just flew off, and it was gone. That was our one and only time ever her and I actually saw something that to this day, I don't have no clue what it was. But that was many years ago. Back in those days, if Davenport had his his online reporting center, we probably would have called and said, "Hey, we saw something."
Yeah, that's true.
But we dismissed it as we don't know what that was. And then the next day, the Statesman Journal, which is the second largest newspaper in the state, said that they had received hundreds of calls from people from Washington and across Oregon that had spotted an unidentified flying object.
Now, UFOs play a big part in the plot of the Ariman Gate. Could you just give us a quick summary of what the novel is about?
Well, I had never written fiction, and a few years ago, some of the emerging sciences of cloning and, in particular, transgenics caught my attention. And I had questions in my own mind about the ethics of both the science and what this might mean for the future of humanity and where these sciences might be taking us. And a college professor friend of mine was talking with me, and he is a best-selling published author of some New Age books years ago. But he was telling me that the new popular media, that if you really wanted to reach the largest possible crowd, you had to write fiction, that's what people were reading. And I knew, of course, that was true in Christianity with the Left Behind books and some of the others, that the real large numbers of people were wanting to read fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And so my wife and I had never done a project together. Both of us have been writers for years, never went to journalism school, but we've been published in magazines and newspapers all across the nation, dozens and dozens of times. And I had written 2 books that were devotional books. And then, of course, started Raiders News Update, which grew significantly beyond what I ever thought it would. I was just doing it as a hobby. So a large part of what her and I do, both as a hobby and also get paid to do, is that we love to write, but had never written fiction. And when he mentioned that, and at the time I was thinking, I want to talk about the ethics of cloning and transgenics. And so her and I got together, and I don't know how the Gilberts do this, but her and I, when we want to brainstorm, when we're driving long distances anywhere, we'll take a notepad,
mm-hmm.
And I began asking her. The funny thing is, if I'm not careful, the things that I do come across way too masculine. And I find that I need her to help me put the more delicate touches on everything. And in this book, we began talking about it. And I said, well, if we were to put a fictional storyline together that also allows us to write into the storyline certain issues that we hope would become a debate,
Mm-hmm.
you would have to help me with the storyline. So she got involved with it, and that's all of the colorful parts of the book, all of the parts of the book that I keep hearing people love, the dog, the old man. All of those things that people love are her ideas. All of the parts I'm getting gripes about, like, oh man, that was gross. And that's stuff so we wanted to do that, and then frankly, I don't know how much of my family history you know about, but I had also grown up in a family where there was a phenomenon going on that I never understood it as a kid, and being raised in a very conservative home where there wasn't much tolerated in terms of outside influence coming into our home. Very conservative, restrictive, Pentecostal Christian family. I grew up with a very narrow worldview and didn't understand much of what other people experienced out there in the real world. And then, as years went by, my brother and I both went to Bible college and began pastoring. But through the years as I pastored, I began seeing what other people were reporting in terms of alien activity and alien abduction, and began seeing that much of what they were describing was identical to things that was happening to my sister as I grew up.
So people in your church were coming to you for advice on how to handle things that you had seen as a child? Things that they were experiencing?
No. What I'm saying is that I began seeing, as I grew up, I set my own set of values. My parents, they didn't like us reading different books or watching TV, that sort of thing. And
sure.
As I got older, I allowed myself to watch movies, and you know what I'm saying?
Okay.
Have a real life. And then as I did, I started seeing things that were being reported on television, newspaper, other forms of media, magazines, that there seemed to be a fairly common thread that went back for, at first I understood decades, and then I understood hundreds of years, and then I understood thousands of years, that the same phenomenon had been reported around the world by different people of faith and no faith, people of all different kinds of ideological persuasion, but that the descriptions of what was occurring seemed to be redundant, seemed to be similar. And so, but then as a pastor and as an evangelical Christian, I still didn't understand how, first of all, how does that have anything to do with what I do as a pastor? And secondly, what does that mean in terms of my worldview and cosmology and things that were very important to me and things that I'm strongly convicted about? And I was pastoring up near Roseburg, Oregon, small church of about, 150 people or something. And somebody brought me a book by Stan Deyo. This was like in 1978. And at that time, Stan had just written this book. And in the book, I remember he had provided copies of his credentials, his security passes and stuff for work, which he claimed that he had been doing with a branch of the U.S. government in gravitical flying research, anti-gravity research. Plus, in addition to that, he had claimed that he had done some undercover work for the FBI. And so anyway, I read the book, and I remember that at the time I thought, okay, here's a guy, he's a born-again Christian, but he's talking about some things that seemed to date back to when I was a kid. Private things that my dad was dealing with that I knew very little about, but enough about to know that things that my dad was doing when I was a kid and was involved in seemed to have parts of it that were similar to what Dale was talking about. And then a few years went by. I still wasn't dealing with this in terms of trying to make any sense out of it. And somebody sent me a book by Dr. I.D. Thomas, and The Cosmic Conspiracy. Now, years later, I got to know Dr. Thomas, and we have visited on occasion, and even now he sends me letters once in a while, or he'll email me and ask me how things are going. what's up? And Dr. Thomas told me one time, he said, he said our evolution towards understanding this phenomenon are similar in that he said I was a Bible college president, and that my kids came to me and said, what do you think about, UFOs? What is this? Is there anything to this? Is it just a bunch of poppycock? Is there something actually happening? Is it spiritual? Is it physical? And Thomas told me, he said, I was going to do 2 lectures. I was going to do a 2-part lecture in a chapel at the Bible college. And he said, I gave the first part, and I gave the second part, and I gave the third part, fourth part. And he said, a year down the road, he said, I was still lecturing. Finally took the things he was talking about and put it in his book, The Omega Conspiracy, which became a bestseller. But so his book, though, made me understand that there were people out there who were not afraid to look at this subject. It wasn't going to change what they believed about God. It was simply maybe, potentially, going to help them understand the history of our planet, angelology, demonology, and Bible prophecy, so both the distant past and the future might be understood more clearly if one could make sense out of what appears to be, evidently, a universal phenomenon. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, today, almost 90% of Americans believe in God. Almost 80% of Americans also believe in extraterrestrials. And so it seems to me that if I'm a pastor and I have a congregation, and I know that the vast majority of those people sitting out there looking at me believe both in God and also in the possibility of extraterrestrials, that I don't want to get up and preach about that every Sunday, but I do have some responsibility to have some fundamental understanding of the phenomenon and how it might be interpreted in terms of future events and Bible prophecy. Mm-hmm. And so it's been for me a learning process and a learning curve that happened over a long period of time, but that the seed of it was in a need in my own spirit, in my own heart, to understand the alien abduction phenomenon, mm-hmm. which something similar to that was occurring with my sister, and then with her daughter, and now with her niece.
So that's still ongoing?
Still ongoing.
Oh, my.
My sister is loath to speak of it now. I don't know if this is exactly the subject we want to talk about, or if we just want to talk about whatever.
Whatever you want to talk about, Tom.
I mean, yeah.
I'm sure our listeners are thinking, stop, don't switch, I want to hear this.
Well, it goes to Derek's question, why did you write this book?
Right.
And part of it, of course, is that we wanted the challenge of writing a fiction book. Secondly, we wanted to include information in the book that's more fact than fiction. And then thirdly, there is this need for me to understand. When my father got out of the Korean War, and us kids were small, he moved to Arizona, and he took a job as a police officer in the small Arizona town of El Mirage. Years later, he worked for the Del Webb Corporation, building Las Vegas, Youngtown, and then Sun City. Mm-hmm. And we grew up along the Agua River. My dad, though, received commendations from the FBI, and my dad was also connected to people on both sides of the law. He didn't talk to us much about that. I learned some of this as I got older. I knew some of it when I was a kid. I just didn't know what it meant. Mm-hmm. And so Dad obviously was the kind of a person that cared deeply about his family, and plausible deniability sometimes can be the best insurance in not getting hurt as a family. Mm-hmm. So Dad never let us in on the maybe the more fantastic elements of his life. But I remember the day, and Dad, he grew up working on the P.I.D ranch, writing fence lines as a boy, for the largest open range ranch in Arizona, literally tens of thousands of acres. He knew the native Indians. He knew Arizona like the back of his hand. So he was surprised years later when he was deer hunting, and he came across, up somewhere in the mountain, came across these large, perfectly spherical cavities that had been cut into the earth. Now, Dad, he worked with people that built Lake Pleasant, built the dams. He knew a lot about that type of stuff, and he had never seen anything like these holes. The holes were full of water, rainwater, meaning that they hadn't been dynamited, otherwise the water would have just leaked out through the cracks in the rock. These were either created by super intense heat, or they looked like they'd been cut by the world's largest diamond bit,
like a router,
down in the earth. Now, I've had a few people that have contacted me that heard me on other programs that said, well, it's probably just some kind of natural phenomenon. But I have pictures of these. They're not natural at all. It's not as if water was leaking or dripping on something over 1 million years and created these holes. These were laid out in a pattern, and they were perfectly round. Anyway, the deer had fallen into them that were trying to drink the water. In fact, Dad told me when I was a kid, he said one of them was still alive. He said it was in there kicking, and he said I wasn't going to try to get it by the horns and pull it out because it would pull me in.
Yeah.
And so he went back to the police department. He got a member of the Army Corps of Engineers to go with him, and they went up and looked at these holes. The Army Corps of Engineers also concluded that they did not know how they were made, which also tells me that they were not natural.
Mm-hmm.
The Phoenix Gazette, which was then the biggest newspaper in the state, may still be, they sent a reporter out there and took pictures of my dad kneeling down beside these holes with his .30-06 hunting rifle in his hands. And they printed a story called Mysterious Mountain Holes. And as far as I know, nobody ever determined how those holes were made. But it was in that same area a few years later that Travis Walton claimed that he was abducted into a UFO.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now there was a movie made about that starring Robert Patrick, who later went on to play in the X-Files, wasn't there?
Yeah, it was called Fire in the Sky.
Yeah, okay.
Right.
And at that time, and may still be, I don't know, but at that time was reported to be the most evidentiary, provable abduction situation in history. But I don't know if that's still true, but at the time it was reported as being the most provable case of UFO abduction in history. Now, I don't think my dad ever knew Travis Walton, and Travis Walton never knew my dad. The connection was that it simply happened in the same mountain range where my dad had discovered those holes years earlier. But what also connected this in my mind was it was only shortly after Dad that the article ran in the Phoenix Gazette. Then my mother told me this story later on. And the thing you have to understand about my family is that UFOs, ufology, all of this was not a part of our world at all. I mean, we didn't talk about this stuff. We didn't think about it. We didn't watch it on TV. It simply wasn't a preconditioning that caused these events. Something else caused these events to set in motion. And my mother, to this day, will not accept the idea of UFOs and of aliens. But if you talked with her, she would tell you that my aunt, who lived down the street from us, came to the house shortly after that article was run in the Phoenix Gazette and said, was ashen white, was frightened, and was telling my mother that she had saw a large spherical object hovering above our house. Well, my mom went outside and didn't see nothing. My aunt was also a Pentecostal Christian and didn't have any reason to make up any of this stuff. But Mom didn't see anything, so that would have been the end of the story, except that, and I do remember this, that a few days later, 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, all of us, including me, were rocketed out of our bed with my sister, who at that time was probably 13, screaming, I mean, like you've never heard before. And we jumped and ran to her room. She was utterly, completely terrified. And I found out days after that she had woke up, come out of a trance, something. And there had been these small, bulbous-headed, 3 foot or so tall gray men standing around her bed.
Mm-hmm.
From that day forward, for the rest of her life, for decades, this event has been repeated over and over and over. will not sleep in a bed because she has dreams of these things coming and taking her by the feet, floating her out of her bed. So she has to sleep in a chair. She has to sleep in a room with other people. But now she won't speak of it at all. If she's going to talk to anybody about this, she'll talk to me. And she really don't want to talk to me about it either. But I can tell you that that night, the first night that it happened, my mother slept with her for the rest of the night, put a Bible under her pillow, put anointing cloths on her, which is something I don't think people use nowadays, but they did back then, and prayed with her. And that phenomenon stopped. And later on in life, my sister became kind of self-destructive. And as I look back through her life, I understand that the events that began when she was a young girl changed her worldview, affected her as a person in terms of the things that she had believed, and now suddenly she didn't know what the world meant anymore.
Sure, it's easy to understand how that could happen.
But prayer worked every time. And every time in her life, I remember when she was, her husband, by the way, had top security clearance, worked at a nuclear facility for the government. And he died mysteriously, and the government never would explain how he died. That's another whole story all to itself. But she's drawing his pension now. She only has a short time to live. She's only in her 50s, but she has every kind of disease known to man. She almost seems to be a walking laboratory of disease. And I remember one time I was seeing a physician, and they were going to do a nuclear bone scan on me. Turned out to be a rare type of arthritis that only people with Indian blood have, which somehow came down through my grandfather. But they were trying to figure out what this was because I was having pain in my joints, and this doctor, who was a Harvard specialist, ordered my family history. And I still remember when I brought him the jacket with all of my sister's information in it, he couldn't believe it. And he was a Harvard graduate, and he said, "There's not a human on the world could have this much stuff wrong with him." And I said, "Well, those are medical reports. She didn't create those. Those are her various doctors. Those are her examinations." And so, in any case, when she was married, every once in a while she would call me, and she would beg me to pray for her because this phenomenon had started again. And every time I prayed for her, every time my brother prayed with her, every time my mother prayed with her, this phenomenon would stop. And for a long time, for 2 or 3 years, it would stop. And over a period of time, she would kind of go back out, start doing her own thing. And when she did, the phenomenon would come back again. This told me that there was a spiritual element to whatever it was that was going on. Somehow, from the moment that gate had been opened, when she quit doing the things that would stop that phenomenon from occurring, it would come back. Now, her daughter, my niece, has almost embraced this whole idea. I think she thinks it gives her a sense of uniqueness. And so for her, the phenomenon happens all of the time. She's a federal employee with the Social Security Division, but she was hand-selected by Steven Spielberg during the time they were promoting the Taken TV series.
Oh, yes, we watched that.
Yeah.
As a person who had, as one of 2 people from the state of Oregon, according to Spielberg's crew, that most likely had been abducted by aliens. And now her daughter, who is a gifted artist, a young girl, that's about 13 or 14, was showing me pictures when I was down in Arizona recently of little gray men that she sees. So I didn't talk to her, but I talked to her mother about it. And so I think, on the one hand, the reason that maybe God has allowed me the opportunity to be an author and a person who has a presence and to be able to talk to people about this is because, in a way, I think I'm almost uniquely qualified to do it, in the sense that it never has happened to me. Therefore, I'm separated enough from it to be objective. But I've watched it happen to people that I know and trust. Therefore, knowing that there is a real phenomenon that is being experienced by many people around the world, and that this phenomenon can be interrupted through spiritual dynamics tells me that in my opinion, we may be dealing with ancient and super intelligent forces, but I think these forces are also defined in the Bible. Mm-hmm. And I think they can be dealt with in biblical ways by Christians.
We're talking with Tom Horn, who is the co-author with his wife Nita of The Ariman Gate, a science fiction novel, but we use the term fiction somewhat loosely here because there are, as Tom has just explained, some very profound elements of fact behind the plot and the storyline. We'll talk about some of those facts and a little bit about the book itself after we take a short break. We'll be right back after this on P.I.D. Radio.
Don't go away.
In the 14th century, the Black Death killed nearly one-third the population of Europe. In 1918, the Spanish flu killed as many as 100 million people. The next great plague may already be spreading. Inspired by today's headlines, it's the Armageddon strain, the explosive new thriller from Sharon K. Gilbert. At a laboratory somewhere in the desert southwest, a secretive group has created a deadly virus for a single purpose: to eliminate 90% of human life. Standing in their way is Dr. Maggie Taylor, a woman broken by grief and alcohol, who must somehow find the strength to unravel the mystery of her father's death in time to stop the virus from being released. Infuse magazine says Sharon Gilbert has a talent for making you feel good, scared, on the edge of your seat, and dying for more. And Christian Fiction Review says Sharon Gilbert does a very nice job of building suspense and horror step by step. The Armageddon Strain from Sharon K. Gilbert, the newest release in the myth arc, the ultimate battle for mankind. Available now online and at bookstores everywhere.
On P.I.D. Radio, I'm Derek Gilbert.
And I'm Sharon Gilbert, and we're talking with Tom Horn, and I don't know about you, but I've got to hear the rest of this. You were telling us about your unique past, which places you in a position that God can uniquely use you to enlighten not just non-Christians, but Christians to what is going on in the spiritual realm that appears as unidentified flying objects or extraterrestrials.
And this phenomenon goes back, what my research finally led me to understand is that if you go all the way back to the beginning of recorded history, the Sumerian cities of Ur and Uruk and Lagash and places where Abraham lived, the beginning of known civilized time on Earth, there are records in the Bible. There are records in every other ancient book of mythology, or what we think of as mythology, which depicts discs that appear in the air. The Sumerians wrote of it. The Assyrians that followed them wrote of it.
The Chinese.
The American Indians.
Oh, yeah, and the people in India. The ancient Hindi myths, yeah.
Around the world, and their depictions are startlingly similar in that they have discs with wings on them. In fact, we named this book Ariman Gate. I didn't realize when we chose that name that so many people would say, "What in the world does that mean?" But Ariman, of course, is the Persian or Zoroastrianistic equivalent of Lucifer, and the story of Ariman opposing Ahura Mazda and being kicked out of heaven, falling to the earth, getting rejected on earth as well, taking up his abode between heaven and the earth. The reason that we also chose to use Ariman, though, is that in Assyrian religion, the Assyrians would go through very elaborate magical ceremonies. Anytime they developed the entrances to a city, to a palace, to elaborate homes, they built archways. And these archways would have these transgenic creatures, part human, part animal, on both sides of these giant archways. These were magical creatures in Assyrian belief, Babylonian belief. And they would also bury under the entryways additional characters, winged falcons, things like that, that carried magic instruments in their hands. The whole idea being that they did this as a form of imitative magic, that if they could stop through their rituals evil forces from coming through those portals, from coming through those gateways, they could stop the forces from coming into their homes. But it was imitative in the sense that their legends went back to a time when the heavens were basically a portal through which both good and evil forces had visited the earth. Of course, Christians would automatically pick up on this and understand that the Bible, the ultimate authority, describes a pre-war which occurred before the writing of the Pentateuch, in which Lucifer rebelled against God, was kicked out of the heavens, fell to the earth, Jesus said, came to the earth and tried to set up his presence here, finally took up his abode between heaven and the earth, formed a kind of gasket heaven that encompasses the earth, from which he seeks to, even today, according to Christian theology, to influence the governments of the world in such a way as to cause them to reject God, to turn their backs on God, to turn their backs on the gospel. So, but when the ancients, everything from Greek to Roman, as we mentioned before, all of these ancient religions, when they described this phenomenon, it's amazing the similarity of discs with wings appearing in the air. If you look in Greek mythology and you look at Isis, who appeals to Thoth, and Thoth descends from heaven in a winged disc, becomes motionless in the air, and Isis goes up into the winged disc and talks with Thoth, and he helps her resolve her problems. And then if you look even further into some of that mythology, do you know that just yesterday I was reading again the mythology of Osiris and Isis and Seth and Horus. Mm-hmm. And I don't know why this had never struck me before. In fact, I even include much of this in my second book, The Gods Who Walk Among Us. But Isis, her husband, brother, Osiris, is murdered by her other brother, Seth, who becomes jealous because they're becoming very powerful gods. Mm-hmm. And but she uses his DNA. I mean, now in the mythology it says that, somehow she resurrects his personhood and she becomes impregnated by him. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't until yesterday, as I was reading through those lines, I thought, if I was a person living on the earth 6,000 years ago, and I had to try to describe advanced DNA cloning, I might put it in this same type of expression as the Greeks did. So, but then, of course, when you look in the Bible, which is the authority, we see watchers coming down to the earth, intermingling their DNA with women, out of which giant life forms are born and walk the earth. It's the same thing that's Sumerian Anunnaki. An event occurred in ancient days in which people of various faith and people of various religion expressed this event. Now, if you follow the logic of modern ufologists, guys like Zachariah Sitch and guys like that ascribe to the ancient astronaut theory, the idea that, okay, the Sumerians just seem to come from out of nowhere. Abraham, Uruk, Samaria, it all just is there. Mm-hmm. And we don't have any records on Earth that date past those events. Why was the Earth here? Why does all of our science tell us that the Earth and the cosmos, everything is hundreds of millions of years old, and we subscribe to this idea of evolution, for which there is no record? Suddenly, 6,000 years ago isn't very long, suddenly man is here, and civilized, living in cities, conducting business, organized religious structures, pantheons of gods and deities. Everything is suddenly there. Well, of course, guys like Eric von Daniken, Zachariah Sitchin, they say this is evidence that super intelligent presences visited the earth, tinkered with apes or monkeys or whatever, hominid DNA, and and accelerated the Earth's evolution.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly man is here.
Yeah, the movie 2001.
Yes. Creationists and intelligent design people look at the very same events and basically describe the very same thing, except that it's not us being made out of monkeys. It's God creating the Earth and creating humanity in one flash moment of time, and then man rebels against God. But the point is, something was happening. And what was happening was being identified by the ancients around the world as being connected to the sky and visitation from the sky by what the Assyrians call flying geniuses, super intelligent presences interacting with the Earth. Now, in the book, The Ariman Gate, we take that same idea, that there are gates or a gate in the heavens. Might not be smart to open it.
Yeah. Sadly, I think someone already tried. Jack Parsons.
Well, yeah, Jack Parsons did try. You know, Aleister Crowley, he years ago, 87 or 88 years ago there in New York City, he was the person that started the, trying to remember, the Almalantra, the Almalantra working.
Yes.
The whole idea behind that, to open a magic portal through which presences could come through and manifest himself. And of course, he claimed to be successful. And the interesting thing is, this presence that he claimed came through, that he called LAM, L-A-M, bears startling resemblance to modern alien grays.
It does. In fact, we'll put a link to that picture with the show notes. That picture is really creepy.
Yeah. Considering that it dates back to 1918.
Yeah, and then later...
the modern UFO movie mythology.
1918, that coincides with that Spanish flu thing. I'll have to think about that. And then in 1946, we've got Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard of Scientology fame doing their Babylon working.
Out in the desert of Arizona.
Yeah. And then what happens, about a year later?
Well, and also what we're finding out is that... these guys tried to revive some of the ancient mystical rituals of Assyrian and Sumerian, Babylonian, Greek, and Egyptian mysticism. And who's to say whether they were or were not successful? A guy like Aleister Crowley, who had wholly given himself over to satanic power, who's to say that Satan didn't choose him in the same way Satan has chosen other people through history to set in motion a series of events? Because, Satan has his idea about the end of times. I'm just glad to know that God does too, and that we're part of that. But the point is, and I've rambled a little bit on this program, but the point is that a phenomenon has been occurring for thousands of years. And why I wrote The Ariman Gate is that part of that phenomenon, in obscure ways, touched my family. And I had a personal interest. I was intrinsically motivated to try to understand what this phenomenon is and why could it touch an average family like mine. I mean, we're not kooky people out there looking to ride around in spaceships. Why would something like this touch my family? And over a long period of time, I come to understand that my dad was probably involved in things that I know hardly anything about, that for whatever reason caused certain forces within both the government and probably spiritual forces to start a series of things that can only be stopped through prayer. But, people have a free will. People have to choose. People have to stand their ground and say, I'm not going to allow this in my life. I'm not going to allow this to touch me.
I'm glad you brought that up. That's important to remember, because God really does allow these things to get to us. That's clear from Job. God is not, absent during these visitations, during this manipulation by the evil forces. He allows it. And it's to turn us to Him.
And not only that, it goes again back to the idea in Assyria that of course they were doing this more from an occultic approach. You perform certain good omens around entryways and gates. But the whole idea is that God has given free will and authority. When he says to his disciples, he not only says the gates of hell shall not prevail against my church, but he says, I give you power and authority. Mm-hmm. But that's something that you have to exercise. If you don't have the will to do it, when I was a pastor, I can't tell you the numbers of men that came into my office for counseling with their wives, and they were losing their marriage and everything else because they had become addicted to pornography or addicted to some other type of activity. But it always went back to these very benign beginnings. Mm-hmm. The little tiny foxes that spoil the vine, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And they began to taste the fruit, and they liked it, and they went for more and more, and finally it had control of them. And now, so what does all of that have to do with the Ariman Gate? It seems to me that as we are approaching the end of time, you see more and more not only the fulfillment of prophecy, but you kind of see the line being drawn in the sand. The division between good and evil, God and Satan. People today are saying things about Christianity in America that we never heard before, challenging the whole ideas of Christianity in ways that we never heard before.
That's true.
But in addition to that, we now have sciences that are being developed that are also being debated in theology that could return us to what I was saying about Isis and advanced cloning of Osiris and the birth of her son from her dead husband. Something was clearly happening in the 6th chapter of the book of Genesis, in which superintelligent presences interacted with humans, out of which giant life forms, which were enemies of God, were born. Now, in the Ariman Gate, we talk about how cloning and transgenics could have significant prophetic value. And it's amazing that our courts and even commissions that have been put together by the President of the United States are debating what portion, what percentage of a human can be transgenically altered without making this creation non-human.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And there's recombinant DNA cloning. There's reproductive cloning, which we're hearing a great deal about with stem cells. There's therapeutic cloning, which will be processes through which people develop different kinds of medicines and technologies to deal with the sick. In our book, we talk about reproductive cloning because it's the type of cloning that would be required for, generating animals, creating life forms. But we're talking about something different than what created Dolly the sheep, and that we're also including in this fictional book the idea of transgenics. Now, in recombinant DNA technologies, you have DNA segments that can be recombined outside of a cell or an organism, and then those are reinserted into the cells and begin to replicate. But with transgenics, it's possible to go even a step further in that you can introduce the genes of one species into the DNA of another species and create a life form that has never existed on Earth. For instance, you could take the genes, let's say, of a snake and insert it into the fertilized egg of a woman. Mm-hmm. And it would become integrated into that DNA of her embryo. Mm-hmm. And now you have a snake human, according to that theoretical application. Mm-hmm. Some of the publicly known experiments that are being done with transgenics include genes from humans being introduced into mice so that they can study things like cancer, things like that.
They have Down syndrome, which was just in the news. They're introducing chromosome 21, human chromosome 21 into mice.
That's right. They've also inserted human genomes into sheep, pigs, and cattle, mm-hmm. Goats. in the hope that they might, like with goats, for instance, that they might be able to produce human proteins in their milk, and then that those proteins can be extracted and used for scientific experiments to try to cure cystic fibrosis or whatever.
One of the most gruesome that I heard, which has been patented, is a Canadian company that injected the gene for creating a certain type of spider protein into goats that they can excrete through their milk so that we can synthesize spider silk from goat milk.
They're already doing that. DARPA.
That is being done, right?
That's being done. DARPA has an interest in that, and the military has an interest in it because spider silk is extremely strong. But how do you start a spider farm?
Yeah, and milking those little buggers.
Oh, it's
yeah. But there will be a point, I think, at which very soon questions will then become, what does it mean now to be a human? And there are institutions around the world that are debating this right now. Not all of them are post-humanist or transhumanist. Not all of them are wanting to go there. They just understand that the science is developing, and whether you like it or not, it's where we're soon going to be. I had one guy, he described it like a black hole. He said, he sent me this thing, it says, it's like a black hole in space, dramatically altering the pattern of matter and energy, accelerating towards its event horizon. And that's true. There is, there is a moment in time. I think Art Bell calls it the quickening. Other people call it the singularity. There is a moment of time, and it's perched at the door right now, in which science is going to reach a moment in time where it could significantly transform everything that we know about the human species. And by the way, also in the course of doing that, transform institutions, our ideas of human life, sexuality, spirituality. It could change everything that you and I have grown up knowing or thinking what it means to be a human being. And so in our book, we tried to take, in the Ariman Gate, we try to take kind of a worst case scenario, which is what you have to do if you want people to stop and think for a moment about where this could really go.
Exactly.
And we say, this could be Pandora's box. This could be the escaping of a biological nightmare. And once it gets out of the box, you can't get it back in. I remember years ago when they created killer bees and they thought they would contain them. And last year, another person died being stung to death by killer bees. And now we're seeing, of course, with transgenically modified crops, that you can't contain these things. Once you create them, they get out of the bottle. They cross-pollinate. And they're changing the environment around them. We had pesticides that were one of our best methods for controlling certain kind of bugs that want to destroy rice or corn. And we get this bright idea that by transgenically altering maize, we can introduce into its species the byproducts of this poison that they were using in the past to spray on them to kill bugs. But then what happens is the gene type changes from one species to another. And what it did was it created a type of modified crop that now when the bugs eat it, they become immune to that pesticide. So now we can't control the bugs. So in very small ways, thankfully, so far, we've seen that we will not be able, kind of like that goofy-looking guy Jeff Goldblum from Jurassic Park and his chaos theory. We will not be able to contain these sciences once they are introduced into the environment. There are people who believe that that is not only possible, but maybe the whole idea. When I think about the Armageddon strain, Sharon, that you wrote, there are institutions and there are forces in our world, whether we like it or not, whether we accept it or not, who don't always have your best at interest. They're driven by money or power or control. There are people in unfortunately, significant positions of authority in the government and in military that are megalomaniacs. Well, I probably won't go there, but the point is, we're not all just good little Christians.
That's another whole show. That's true. And, everything you're talking about, it is so important that the Christian community latch onto this. And it's something that we have not done. We need to get ready for this huge delusion that is coming, that is already here.
Well, and where I was going with that is that it's God himself who commanded that there be a species barrier.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I often say tongue-in-cheek, what is it that God knows that we don't know besides a whole lot? But the truth is, why would God have done that? When I was in Bible school, this was one of the places in the Bible where our professor told us that agnostics, atheists, unbelievers, critics, atheists would point to, and they would say that it's obvious the Bible wasn't inspired by an all-knowing God, otherwise these ancients would have known that in the Levitical law where it condemns a man lying down with a beast or a woman lying down with a beast, that this did not have the probability of procreation. And they point at that and say, obviously this couldn't be inspired because God would have known that no offspring could come from man and woman practicing bestiality. But isn't it interesting? There were sciences that existed in ancient days that we don't have today.
Mm-hmm.
So, first of all, we don't know for sure exactly what may have been being implied other than bestiality. But secondly, look at how now God's laws of ethics and morality reach through time and space and touch us today at a time where we have science. To me, this goes to the inspiration of the Bible. That there were laws put in place that only apply today.
That's a very interesting observation. One of the points I was going to make, but I think your observation is right on the money, is that some of the satanic ritual abuse practices and things that Aleister Crowley was involved in, which involve breaking down of sexual taboos, all relates back to the sexual practices introduced by the fallen rebellious angels, the Watchers, when they came to Earth and defiled the daughters of men, and very probably other types of animals as well, to produce these giant offspring whose remains we find even today. And that these practices are still engaged in by occult followers today because they believe that by emulating the practices of these fallen angels, they draw on their power. And so that may have been part of the reason that God prohibited the Hebrews from engaging in those practices. But again, your observation that the procreation of human and animal is only possible now within the last couple of years, and it may well be that the reason God prohibited it was for this time and not the days of the ancient Hebrews.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it probably includes both. With most of the laws of God, there was more than one singular reason behind why he gave certain rules within the scriptures that we were to follow. And I'm sure that there were very practical reasons. They say AIDS actually began out of bestiality. There are reasons why God, for the spread of disease and things like that, put many of the laws in the Levitical Code. But there was a deeper reason, and that had to do with preserving the bloodline that would lead to the time of Christ.
Right.
That is right.
And it seems like that this also goes to evidence that we're talking about spiritual forces that are hostile to God, in that their efforts, and their rituals, their magical rituals, everything they inspire people to do tends to degrade humanity and cause for the debasing of the human species, and in particular with issues of sexuality and procreation. And this goes back to the Nephilim, what they were trying to do by in fact, you make the point that it was not just the daughters of men, but it was also animals. I remember the day years ago when the light went on my head about the flood, because I'd always wondered, why would God send such a fiat of judgment upon the earth? When God is God, he could have sent a couple of angels down, just dealt with the evildoers, and he could have left all these kids and these little animals and stuff alone. Well, this tells us that something beyond what we understand today probably had occurred. It probably goes along with the idea that there was a universal contamination of DNA. And this makes the comments about Moses, who was where it says he was perfect, in his generation or before God, because
Noah.
Noah, because we know that Noah was not, in fact, a perfect human.
No, he wasn't. As Guy Malone said.
Yeah, I talked to Guy Malone yesterday, and he said, "Yeah, Noah wound up drunk and naked like the rest of us."
Yeah. That's right.
Speak for yourself, Guy.
That's exactly right. Well, but the point is, so what did it mean? And the word is the same word that's used in the Levitical code to describe an unblemished sacrificial lamb. It went to what the creature was physically, physiologically, biologically, and something had happened where life on Earth, animals, humans, everything had become biologically contaminated. Now, most Bible scholars say that if that actually occurred, if that's what happened, if that theology is true, and more I think scholars believe it was true, that it was an effort on the part of Luciferian powers, satanic powers, to cut off the birth line of the Messiah. One of the things, and I don't want to cast any criticisms about any other books, but when we wrote the Ariman Gate, one of the things that I did not like with books like the Left Behind series was it seemed to me that the Antichrist was fairly easily tricked by a band of people running around, flying around in planes here and there.
Mm-hmm.
Very good point.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. We've talked about that too.
And so I thought, I don't want a Three Stooges type Antichrist. Because the truth is, he will be the incarnation of infinitely long years of collective knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
He won't be easily tricked. The fact is, he won't be overcome if it isn't God himself that does it.
Right.
So the same God who beat him the first time will beat him the second time, but men won't be able to do it. And that's why when we wrote the Ariman Gate, we said, God chooses the little things. One of the things I loved about the old movie, The War of the Worlds, H.G. Wells wrote The War of the Worlds, and these super intelligent forces come down in their ships, and they start conquering Earth, and no matter what we do, nuclear power, nothing even phases these characters. Suddenly they start falling over dead, and we learn after the fact that God had chosen the tiniest microscopic things that he had put into Earth elements that we were immune to, but that infected these creatures and killed them. And so God in his wisdom had created an atmosphere that would take care of a problem that we wouldn't possibly be able to handle in terms of our own technological efforts. So when we wrote the Ariman Gate, I said, I want to choose the simple things. Something that nobody would even see coming. And if you've read the book, you know how it ends. Mm-hmm. I don't want to spoil it.
I was going to say, I haven't finished it. Don't spoil it.
Oh, yeah. Well, I won't. So I don't want to spoil it for anybody. But what we wanted to do is show that whatever men try to do, whatever their efforts are, it will be inadequate in terms of combating these ancient spiritual forces. But God always has a way. God always has a plan in place. And now we're looking, I think, one of the characters in the book, Father Malachi Molina, who is, of course, a parody of Malachi Martin, who I had admiration for, even though I'm an evangelical and he was a Catholic, but I had great admiration for him.
So do we.
And so loosely based on his character, but this character in my book, he believes that we're seeing the potential repeat of ancient history, that what happened in the book of Genesis is about to happen again. Mm-hmm. With the return of the Nephilim, with the return of transgenics of the highest order.
Mm-hmm. The tares in the field.
What's that?
Yeah, the parable that Jesus tells his disciples about the kingdom of heaven being like a field.
Yes.
And the good seed is sown, and then overnight the enemy comes in and sows his seed.
That's right. Well, look, when I was doing the research for this book, we brought on board Dr. Bob Hakala, who is a medical doctor, an expert, and also a person who has a background in genetics and a knowledge of transgenics. And so that he would help us make sure that, even though when you read the book, there's not a significant amount of heavy scientific discussion in there, but we wanted, if somebody was in that field to read it, we wanted them to think, okay, this sounds believable, you know.
And just as a quick insert, that's one of the things I really enjoyed about the Ariman Gate. I compared in my review of the Ariman Gate it to Frank Peretti meets Tom Clancy. Mm-hmm. My number one complaint about Clancy is that when he describes a nuclear device, he tells you how to build the thing, and you don't need all that for the plot. So I appreciated that, Tom.
Yeah. Well, but one of the things that Hackala said, he said, and I've not only dealt with him in terms of email and letters and research, but sat down with him on occasions, and we'd have long discussions. And here's what he told me. He said molecular biologists working in these fields, he said they classify the functions of genes, what genes do, in other words, but they classify them inside of their own species. That's the only way to study them in a laboratory. But he said what none of these scientists that are working in this field know is how a gene's coding might change from one species to another species. He said that's the big unknown, and he said there's possibilities that when you start creating transgenic sciences, that the interspecies differences are going to affect those genes-protein interactions, and he said hereditary traits will start being changed in humans, and once it gets out of the bottle and people are intermarrying, there will be no possible way in the world to contain it. No way. No way. Because you would never know, looking from one human to the other, who might contain the differences in those gene characteristics. And so we talked about, like movies like X-Men, and you have Wolverine, and he's got the instincts of an animal. But it's not only that creating those types of characters in the future is possible. According to everybody that I'm reading, it's not only possible, it's where we're headed. National Geographic said that literally within 10 years from right now, the human species won't even be what it is today in terms of where this science is taking us. Now think about that. My son just had a baby daughter. And so now my newest grandchild is several months old, and I'm looking at her and I'm holding her, and I'm realizing that when she's only 10 years old, that according to all of the science journals and everything that everybody's talking about right now, the people in the know, I'm not talking about, nutcases, but people that work in these fields, scientists and doctors and people that are getting federal grants for genetic research, are telling us that we are moving towards this singularity moment that we're moving towards includes transhumanism, changing us from what we are now into something else. Now, there will be people who will say, well, I don't want to go along with it. I don't want to be part of it. Well, maybe you won't, and maybe you won't be part of it, but people around you will. And as those people are being nanotechnologically and biotechnologically altered from what they are right now, over a long period of time and through intermarriage, it will affect every human on the planet.
That's right.
And so the character in my book says, not only did this happen in the Old Testament, not only could it happen now, but he believes it's being designed intentionally by super intelligent forces that are in league with government and military, laboratory fields of science, and that there is a prophetic reason behind why this is advancing in the times we live in. And anybody listening to this broadcast, they could go to betterhumans.com or just go to Google or Yahoo and type in transhumanism and start following those searches, and you'll be stunned at some of the research laboratories you lead back to. Mm-hmm. People that are well-funded, well-known, that are creating transgenic life forms as we speak. And they're in the environment now in terms of the plants and animals. That's why we have bizarre creatures that are showing up in our streams that scientists have never seen before. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because slowly it's getting out of the bottle like it always does, and it always will.
Yeah. And the thing to remember is that if we are hearing about the things that we're hearing about in the news are well behind the cutting edge of the technology.
Boy, that's the truth.
Oh, yeah, exactly. If you see it in the paper, you can bet that was done 20 years ago. And what they're doing now is 20 years beyond that story.
Right.
Yep. Boy, we've just scratched the surface here, Tom, and we'd love to continue on, but we operate under the limits of certain technology here that run the risk of cutting us off if we go too much farther on the battery power that we're forced to employ.
Here in the bunker.
We certainly encourage people to read the Ariman Gate. Sharon's partway through it. I have read it and couldn't put it down. It does deal with what may come. Tom and Nita Horn have done their homework as far as the technology that they incorporate. We didn't even touch on some of the military technology that you used in the book that some would look at and say, it's science fiction, creative imagination, but I suspect that there's a little more reality there than most people would think. But again, due to time limitations here, we really can't delve into that today. But
well, I know our listeners want to know how to get the book, so can you tell them?
Yes.
Sure, they can get it at RaidersNewsUpdate.com. It's just like the football team, RAIDERS, RaidersNewsUpdate.com. They can also get it at Amazon. I got a notice from the publisher yesterday that Barnes & Noble's, the bookstores, actually ordered a large quantity. It's starting to show up in bookstores. So they can go to any bookstore, Amazon, or RaidersNewsUpdate.com and get the book there.
Excellent.
Yeah, well worth the investment. And I also encourage, as background information, people to read the articles, a series of articles that you've written on Stargates, ancient rituals, and those invited through the portal. I've been sending links to those articles to friends of mine and our 15-year-old daughter who's got an interest in ancient Greek and Roman mythology, and encouraging her to connect the dots between the research that you've done and the ancient gods that they study in their high school literature classes, because there very definitely are connections between the historic gods who walked among us and the so-called fictional gods of ancient Greece and Rome.
So now she's discussing those articles with her teachers.
Oh, and I'm not sure how many articles there are going to be, but frankly, I mean, right now, while I'm inspired to do this, it'll probably wind up being many, many parts.
Well, that's wonderful, because it's fascinating reading, Tom, and it's stuff that I'm collecting and saving in my hard drive for future reference for the work that we're doing here.
Oh, so. Yeah. God bless you for doing this, Tom.
Oh, well, you're welcome. And by the way, if you ever write anything that I like, and you have, I'll steal it too. So.
Thank you for your time, Tom, and God bless you. Tom Horn of Raiders News Update, co-author with his wife Nita of the Ariman Gate, available now at a bookstore near you and online at bookstores everywhere.
Thank you for inviting me on your show.
You're welcome. God bless you, brother. Bye-bye.
I later had the honor of doing the audiobook version of the Ariman Gate. And I made Tom laugh. I said, the next time you and Nita decide to write a novel, don't write so many characters that are described as having really gravelly voices, because that was really rough.
It really is. Those of you who have never had to read aloud a novel, an entire novel, it does take a lot of time, not just to read it and record it, but also to process it afterwards. So you worked hard on that.
But I was honored to do it, and it just reinforced Tom's gift, not just as a speaker, teacher, preacher, but also as a storyteller.
And Nita's as well. A lot of her went into that book.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So, that was our very first interview with Tom Horn, and we had the pleasure of interviewing him again about 6 months later.
6 months later, and a number of times through the years, but this week we'll feature the first 2 interviews we ever did with Tom Horn, just to give you a sense of where we were 18 years ago, where Tom was then. And we will come back with the second interview from March of 2006 after the break.
Hi, everybody. Believe it or not, this is October, and that means you get a brand new GHTV special offer.
We're approaching Halloween, the time of year when the world around us is focused on ghosts and goblins and devils and demons.
But they're real.
They're real, and we'd like to give you good information about those entities with our October special. First, our book Veneration, where we analyze the ancient cult of the Nephilim, the origin of demons exposed in this book. Vicki Joy Anderson's important book, They Only Come Out at Night, about night terrors and sleep paralysis.
You need this book at home for your kids and grandkids. Trust me, it is a great book.
And 7 hours of audio interviews with the late Dr. Michael Heiser about the nature of the unseen realm.
Oh, this is a collector's disc.
It really is. Altogether, these 3 items purchased separately worth $65 during the month of October, just $35 plus shipping and handling. Take advantage of this because this is good, solid, scholarly information, especially the content from Dr. Heiser.
It is, and particularly this month, you want to be armed with the truth when your family asks, what about witches? What about wizards? What about these things at Halloween? What do we do with this? It's a time to teach.
Absolutely. Take advantage of our October special offer. Veneration, they only come out at night, and The Unseen Adversary, yours for just $35 plus shipping and handling only at gilberthouse.org/store. Welcome back to P.I.D. Radio. I'm Derek Gilbert.
I'm Sharon Gilbert, and we just are so honored to be revisiting these old episodes with Dr. Tom Horn.
This was a very early in our career, and again, you'll hear the difference in the audio quality between then and now. But,
and the difference in our voices.
Difference in our voices, too.
Voices
That's really surprising. Yeah.
Yep.
It's like, boy, no wonder I was singing tenor back then. But we had just...
It's all those, it's reading on the Ariman Gate that really lowered your voice.
Yeah, I imagine it was. All that, raspy voice. We used to listen to Steve Quayle's broadcast every night.
Mm-hmm.
And it came to us not via shortwave, although he was putting it out on shortwave radio, but it was an audio stream, little 8 kilobit per second audio stream, which is worse than AM radio quality. But Tom was a regular guest on Steve Quayle's program back then. And he did a program with Steve on the subject of dominionism or kingdom now theology, the New Apostolic Reformation, and its belief that we need to take over the world. And I had never heard any of that before.
No, I'd grown up on that practically because it was, I won't name the ministries, but there were television ministries that were preaching that kind of thing and putting out books about it. And so I had read a lot about it over the previous couple of decades, I guess.
Well, for me, this was
I was
new.
an old lady when you knew me.
Well, you were raised up in a church that had a more, I think, thorough understanding, a better understanding of the spiritual war that we're in. I never heard any talk like that in the churches I grew up in.
Yeah, one of the books that our pastor handed me one Sunday, I think I was probably 16. It was called Demons, Demons, Demons. What's that tell you?
Wow, yeah. No, the churches I grew up in tended to look at Jesus as more of a cosmic life coach. Use him as an example to live a better life now.
No.
Which, okay, yeah, that's true to a point, but that's not the focus, or shouldn't be.
So understand again, the quality of this isn't the best,
right?
But it is the content that matters so much, and we were just honored to get to talk to him.
From March of 2006, Tom Horn on P.I.D. Radio.
We're pleased to welcome back to our guest line Tom Horn, the publisher of Raiders News Update and co-author with his wife Nita of the Ariman Gate. Tom, welcome back to PID Radio.
Hey, Derek, thanks for inviting me back on your show.
Sorry that Sharon's not here. She's the other half of my brain, so you have to work with me.
I understand completely.
Well, you raised the topic during an interview with Steve Quayle on the Q-Files radio broadcast a couple of weeks back that attracted attention from regulars on our forum, and I know that you probably got a lot of feedback from this as well, and that was the subject of dominionism within the body of Christ, Christian dominionism, and how it's going to affect the perception of the end times, the coming disclosure event.
Right.
First of all, just to lay the groundwork, what is dominionism?
Just in the most basic definition, dominionism is the idea that we as Christians can, through the legal system and legislation, political maneuvering, we can reclaim the dominion that we lost in the Garden of Eden. We can take control of the political systems of the earth. We can therefore implant morality of God in the hearts and minds of men through legal enforcement, and we can become the custodians of the earth that God wanted us to be in the book of Genesis, and that we can perfect the earth and therefore present it to Christ as having been reclaimed and perfected, and then therefore Christ can return. I mean, in a nutshell, when you're dominionism, as we'll discover tonight, and we talk more about the deeper parts of this subject, is significantly more complex than that. But in a nutshell, the whole idea is to take control, to take it back from the evil people who run our courts and legislative systems and congressional halls, and to perfect it so that Christ can return.
What's wrong with that idea?
Well, look, there's nothing wrong with voting the way we think Jesus would want us to vote.
Okay.
And I said on the program that kind of started this last week when I was on with Steve Well, and by the way, we weren't even talking about dominionism, we were talking about dual covenant theology, but if it served a purpose, it at least raised some significant issues, I think, for the church to consider doctrine that are firmly entrenched in the church now, in particular dominionism, which in my mind is heretical. And of course tonight I want to explain why. But I also said on that program that by bringing up the issue of dominionism, I was not saying that there's anything wrong with a Christian voting for what they believe to be morally right, or voting against things that they believe to be against biblical ethics. And furthermore, there's nothing wrong with Christians being political activists. If that's, I would suppose some people may be given, a particular calling, a gift to be able to be involved in the political sphere. But that's completely different than selling the church on the idea that to be good stewards of our time on earth, that we're actually holding up the return of Christ by not seizing control of earthly power in order to implement the morals and values, to impose them, if you will, on people, to make them live by whatever standards we deem are those that are in line with the will of God. And I have to tell you that all of this began for me a long time ago in the 80s. I hadn't even really thought that much about it lately because, I started out preaching about and then yelling about and then screaming about the whole thing, that I thought was a problem with dominionism back in the 80s, and it seemed to just consistently fall on deaf ears and wasn't doing anything more than making people mad at me. And so I finally just let it go. But it was my belief that dominionism would become a dominant evangelical heresy that, in my mind, would undoubtedly lead untold numbers of believers into a false gospel, and frankly, provide the doormat for the appearing of the Antichrist. Well, I have to tell you, I believe that more now than I've ever believed it before. Back then, the leaders of the church, the bobbleheads and the entertainment figures and the media elite, they started out talking about, and you might remember this, they started out talking about what was called kingdom age theology. Do you remember that?
Vaguely. That was in my nominal Christian phase when I was working in top 40 radio, playing music that I prefer my daughter not listen to now. Sharon would remember that, though. Yes. Yeah.
Well, kingdom age theology was just kind of the early precursor to the broader, what became the Reconstructionist movement, and then now, of course, what's more commonly thought of as dominionist theology. And most of the people that I hung around with back then in the early days when we were talking about kingdom age theology weren't paying that much attention to it. It just seemed to be part of the name it and claim it crowd, and the people that I hung out with, they just would kind of smile, you know what I mean, and look the other way. But then, and I guess, Derek, because of human nature, a large number of believers just started buying into those ideas and those ideologically driven, politically driven pulpiteers. We started seeing mainstream churches mobilizing adherents to become more and more politically involved. And sadly, along the way, and this was what I guess hurt me, as they became more and more politically involved, they became less and less interested in quiet devotion and their spiritual habits and spiritual life, and the whole thing in the church started turning. I mean, it started becoming about power and domination, political authority, economic power, affluence. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. Whatever it might take to accomplish the Reconstructionist vision of the dominionists, who said, you know, we need to be about reclaiming what we lost in the Garden of Eden, and for whatever reason, it didn't then, and it doesn't now appear that those people understood that when they're talking about the dominion we had in the Garden of Eden, it wasn't a legal taskmaster, but it was more of a caring overseer. I mean, Adam and Eve were given a privilege, an opportunity. They weren't given a billy club by God. At least that's certainly not the way that I read. The kind of authority that they were given in the Garden of Eden would have been reflective of the kind of authority that Jesus Christ had when he took upon himself a pastoral kind of authority where he could care for the things that had been created by God. But in any case, nobody seemed to care about that in the 80s. I shouldn't say nobody, but what caught on was the dominionist dogma. And when Ronald Reagan won the 1980 presidential election by a landslide, and by the way, I voted for Reagan, and I loved him, and I loved a great deal of his policy, and I wish we had a great deal of his policy right now over what we have. Mm-hmm. But when he did, because of his willingness to invoke the name of God and things like that the church, you know, had not seen in any president in modern time before him. Mm-hmm. When that happened, it happened on the heels of some of the more prominent today dominionists who were just coming to their own. I mean, they were just coming to power. And by then, you know, the rising stars included Pat Robertson and Ralph Reed and Jerry Falwell, and that's how we got on this last week, because of Jerry Falwell's name being used. But Jerry Falwell formed the moral majority with those people that were involved with him, and those guys went right out and they started saying that the Reagan victory was their victory. Mm-hmm. And they went to their donors, and I mean, there was hundreds of thousands of dollars spent on literature that went out into the mail, and they were literally taking Reagan, one piece of Reagan, one side of Reagan, and sending out information to all the little dominionists out there that were supporting them, and saying that, man, you know, look, God has given us the victory, and now we have to seize the opportunity to take over the world, starting with the United States, you know, the courts and legislation and Congress, and because God has saw our labor, and he has given us this victory, and now everybody needs to get on board, because obviously this is the will of God. And I remember it because I was pastoring, receiving all of that material, mm-hmm. and frankly, at that time, I was more with those early dominionists than I was against them, because I hadn't yet come to understand what now I believe to be some of the fallacy of the whole idea. And brother, I mean, Christians bought it by the tens of millions because the preachers wrapped it in the right use of Scripture, and they made it sound so good, and they made it sound so right. But I'll tell you, as a senior pastor of one of the larger churches on the West Coast, I watched what happened. I mean, over time, you know, as a guy who was voted in as a presbyter and working with a lot of other pastors who were coming to me for leadership, I watched how their Wednesday night prayer meetings gave way to fundraisers for local political lobbyists who would come into the churches, and they were promising that together we're going to retake America for Christ. And man, that became the theme, you know, Sunday morning revivalists. They weren't invited anymore. Suddenly, everything that was old school was being displaced by politicians who were being invited to come in on Sunday morning and speak to the congregation about what the believers could do to participate in the legislative process, now that we understand that the second coming of Christ is being held up in anticipation, you know, of us dumb believers who somehow had missed in the New Testament example that we were supposed to be about establishing God's kingdom here on earth. And,
I thought Jesus said something about the kingdom being inside of us and not something that we voted into a particular office.
Yeah, inside of us, but we need to get it out and get it in office.
I see. The dominionist theory. Okay, I missed that part of the gospel there. It almost seems to me, and see what you think of this analogy, it almost strikes me as being like the activity of the behavior of the Christians in the time of Constantine, who suddenly have access to the halls of power and just went nuts with it. Is that a valid comparison, do you think?
Absolutely, and yeah, I mean, there's not much new in history, and history tends to repeat itself. And right now, if the neocons in the White House are the political version of foreign policy, which could be the precursor to an antichrist global police state system, then dominionism is the religious side of it. It's the religious system on which the false prophet can write in to support the anti-Christian system. But we can talk about that a little bit later. But
right, yeah, I'll get to that in a few minutes. It really is interesting, though, that this process is facilitated by believers who want to see what they believe are Christian morals being enforced in the government system that we have here, while ignoring things, say Nancy Reagan consulting an astrologer when she made Ronald's calendar every day.
Well, that's right. But look, there was a lot of pressure, to join the movement early on by all of us pastors who were involved. And people, there's a lot of fallacies in human nature, and one of them is that we want to be associated with success, and we want to be accepted by the people who we believe to be successful. And when all of a sudden the big mouthpieces were heralding, what was going on with and I think they, to some extent, they just used the election of Ronald Reagan for their own benefit. He may have benefited too from the Christian vote. I'm sure he did, but Reagan continued to be popular with everybody, including atheists, as far as I know. But in any case, that was the turning point, and that's why I referred to it, is because the Kingdom Age teaching was being taught, but it wasn't until Reagan came in that, all of a sudden and almost overnight, things changed, and people latched on to this presidential election and the willingness of Ronald Reagan to refer to God and Christ and quote the Bible and all those things, and so now all of a sudden we were entering into a new age, a new dispensation, a new revelation from God to His church concerning His will for His people. And at first, because I was pastoring, and I've also always had this side interest in politics, I joined those voices for a short while. I was a keynote speaker at some of their local political rallies. But like I said on the Q-Files the other night, the very last Trinity Broadcasting Crusade that we did in my church family worship center, Carlton Pearson was there, Dwight Thompson was there. We raised tens of thousands of dollars for Dwight Thompson, and I remember when I was driving Dwight back to the airport and him telling me how he was going to use that money to win several cities for God. I never did hear any more after he flew out of town, but maybe he did, I don't know. But Nancy Harmon was there. She filmed her love special for Trinity Broadcasting that week. But shortly after that, and I mean literally just within maybe a month, just something inside me. It didn't feel right. It didn't sound right. Maybe it went back to my upbringing, my grandmother being a Methodist, and coming up from maybe more, and the Methodists back then, by the way, weren't anything like they are today either.
Right, yeah.
But, I said Methodist, I mean Mennonite. and just these older, more pastoral type congregations where you didn't really wear your religion on your sleeve, and your Christianity wasn't measured by how high you jumped or how far you rolled or whether you laughed in the spirit or you had any of them other things. It really had more to do with your integrity. I know my granddad was Abe Lincoln, honest, and you never had to have a contract with him. If he told you he was going to do something, he would do it to his own hurt. He would never, ever go against his word. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. Right.
These were old ethics that I grew up under, and suddenly something about the superficiality of a lot of the entertainment side of what I was in, and what some of the stuff behind the scenes that I was witnessing too. I mean, a lot of it just really started feeling wrong to me, and I began questioning a lot of it. And so then here I was, you know, I'm pastoring Family Worship Center, and I come along, and I start becoming the cog in the wheel, you know, by questioning. First, privately, behind closed doors. As I'm talking to you right now, I remember some of those meetings where I'm sitting behind closed doors, and there's 10 or 15 people, and these are power brokers in Christianity. And I'm saying to them, really? I mean, really? Is this really where we want to go? Because I have some problems with some of this stuff, and I think we're getting off track. I think we're abandoning Christ. I think we're attaching ourselves to apostasy. I think we're opening the door for Christians to have a justification for abandoning the disciplines of true New Testament Christianity and selling out cheaply by feeling that they somehow can be justified by pulling a voting lever the right way. I just have a feeling that the kingdom of God is not made of the kind of material that we're selling here. And I'll tell you, it didn't make me very popular. I was a keynote speaker at the National Religious Broadcasters Convention, and it was the last time. The last time, because I got up and I dared to actually mention a book written by Pat Robertson, and I dared to actually say, I fear this is opening the door for the development of a system that's going to lead to the implementation of the Antichrist. Well, you could have heard a pin drop. Wasn't a whole lot of shouting going on that night, and but I truly believed it. And of course, you know, that night I was well prepared, and I mean, I was articulate. I didn't sound like the Okie I am right now. I was convincing, at least in my own mind, you know. And you have to understand, Derek, I was, and I still am, friends with some of those people. Dr. James Kennedy, who has been a leader in D.C. among the politically enthused evangelicals now for some time. In fact, some writers say that he's probably, behind the scenes, he's probably the most powerful man in Christianity today. And but he wrote a long personal letter to me just a few years ago, on official church letterhead, by the way, from his church, and thanking me for accurately reflecting his viewpoints when I would speak in public. And he wrote an endorsement for my second book, The Gods Who Walk Among Us. I never asked him to do that. I never even talked to him about it, and it just kind of came from out of the blue. But Kennedy, of course, was considered by most reporters to be the architect of Justice Sunday last year, and the stated purpose, of all of that, and everybody who's part of it, Focus on the Family and everybody else, is to educate people of faith as to how the judiciary impacts society, and how activist judges, for the most part, are, in their opinion, anti-Christian, and therefore we need to make sure that we get these people out of courts, or when they retire, we replace them with the right people, so that the judiciary, as you started this broadcast saying, can either implement or enforce or support law and rules that go to biblical ethics, or at least biblical ethics as they are defined by dominionists, which many times you and I would probably agree with, and maybe sometimes we wouldn't. All of it sounds so good. It sounds so real, man. It sounds like exactly what we ought to be about.
Right.
But what people need to understand is that when it comes to dominionism, it is in fact a cult. And I want to try to race forward because I know we only have so much time. It's not only a cult, Derek, in my opinion, it's a cult of the worst kind. And that was what I started becoming concerned with back in the 1980s. I've been concerned with it ever since. When I finally decided to walk away, and I have to tell you, it concerns me. The whole idea of it concerns me now more than ever before. I'm actually thankful that the Jerusalem Post either printed something that was true and then denied, or inadvertently printed something that never was true last week, because it brought us to a subject that I think has a lot to do with where we're at in the world right now. It has a lot to do with where we're at in the church. It has a lot to do with where we are in the administration. People who believe that they are doing the will of God by blending earthly politics with church authority.
Right.
And it seems to me that there are significant, and what should be obvious, I think now, problems. Not just problems, scary, prophetic possibilities in that mix.
Well, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, not just talking about confusing foreign policy with end times eschatology, but I mean, just looking back at history and all the problems that this world has had when you mix earthly power with professed authority from God. I mean, the whole history of Christianity from the time of Constantine, on, basically has been about the misuse of earthly power in the name of God.
That's right.
And, ironically, I think in certain sectors, and in some ways, evangelical Christians may be more like the medieval Roman Catholic Church than they care to believe.
Well, and that's where dominionism is taking us. Look, theoretically, now I'm only talking theoretically, it is possible to have either a true theocracy. Now, if you look up the word I haven't done this in a gazillion years, but if you look up the word theocracy in a dictionary, it probably says something about the attempt to form for the government to operate through under God, through somebody's idea or interpretation of the rule of God. But purely in a theological sense, when you talk about theocracy, you're talking about what Israel had before they asked God for a king. You're talking about
the time of the judges.
Yeah, I mean, well, what I was going to say is that you can have one or the other, but you can't have both.
Right.
At least not simultaneously. And that whole notion is irreconcilable. What dominionism tries to do is not possible, really, in theology. Remember, when they did ask God for a king, God says to them, "I'm all you need." And at that point, when the cloud moves, you move with the cloud. When the cloud stops moving, you stop moving. You know what I mean? And they just followed God, and it was a spiritual thing. I mean, an invisible force was leading the covenant people. That was a theocracy. And then, they had the leaders of the tribes, and they had the prophets who could speak and whatever, but they were led only by whatever God said and did at that moment. But then they insisted that they wanted to have a dominionist form of government. They wanted both God and an earthly king. They wanted politics and spirituality. And so God gave them Saul, and their problems began. Why would the church today think that it is a good idea to, from the pulpit, ecclesiaze political figures in order to satisfy the work of God, whenever we know that God the Father in the Old Testament and Jesus in the New Testament made it clear what you said at the outset of this program, that His kingdom is not of this earth, and that what is rendered to Caesar is different than that is rendered to God.
Well, it's because there's a quid pro quo. That's why. I mean, that's the pastors are getting something out of their support for specific political figures.
Well, certainly those who have something to gain monetarily or megalomaniacally, whatever that word is, in terms of either power and control and affluence or dollars or whatever. I mean, there's obviously those people, but And those are people who they make their own decisions, and if they're going to go down that path, they're going to be judged by God. But what hurts your heart are the flock. Those that listen to their shepherd and they buy it. And they think it's right, and therefore they pour part of their lives into building this kingdom on earth. And what they don't realize is that by focusing the energy of the church on political reform and aspirations as opposed to the preaching of the gospel, they're actually stripping the church. They're stripping the body of Christ. They're stripping their local community from what Paul called the dynamic, the dunamine, the dynamite of God, the power of God unto salvation. They're taking that out of their communities, because true spiritual life, it doesn't come from the pulling of a voting lever. True spiritual life is the antithesis, Paul says, to the law, in that what the law could not do, in that it was weak, Christ came, and he died, and he offers us a spiritual authority, a spiritual reclamation, a spiritual power, a spiritual life, a true faith. And so, when we're talking about dominionism, you just have to make the point that more important than just having faith is having faith in the right thing.
Right. Everybody has faith in something, but is what you have faith in true?
And there's no doubt that, I don't know what the numbers are up to now, but they're in the tens of millions of people that consider themselves to be evangelical Christians who actually believe. They believe that they are satisfying a responsibility to God by going into the voting booth on election day and pulling the voting lever for the, most of the time nowadays for the Republican Party.
Right, yeah.
Now, and like I said earlier, I believe that voting is a privilege. In fact, in America, I can buy that it is a duty. But that doesn't have anything, or at least very little, to do with the preaching of the gospel or the fulfilling of the Great Commission. And anybody who disputes that, any dominionist that wants to dispute that, I would challenge to show me the precedent in the life of Christ or in his disciples or the New Testament church in the book of Acts. Show me where they practiced or taught that voting and politicking, making yourself part of the local political process, was the method for satisfying the Great Commission. That's baloney.
Well, exactly. No, you're exactly right. He told the 70 when he sent them out, go to the towns and preach, and if they won't listen to you, leave and shake the dust from that town's dust from your sandals as a reproach on your way out of town.
And that's the problem with dominionism, because dominionism actually seeks to stealthily establish a state church, a federal church.
You're right.
Pat Robertson, because he's an attorney, he knows that the First Amendment to the Constitution under the Establishment Clause would never allow unless we change it, would never allow the U.S. government to create a federal church outright. And so, much of what I learned this by being there, by the way, much of dominionism's quest is to use state and federal courts to impose their vision of God's will for everybody else by keeping quiet about what their true, far-reaching goals are. Once again, I've actually been there. I remember being the guy who was speaking. I was selling this stuff, man. I was selling my books, but I had the brochures all over my tables as the crowds were being told to be careful, be friendly. Don't push your ideology, at least not at the early points in time. We need to get our people in power. I'm not kidding you, Derek.
No, I have done enough research on it to know that to have learned that this is a belief that is being that guides the actions of those who believe that the political system and the courts are the means to enact God's will here on earth.
That's right. And once we have our people in position at everything from school boards to the federal courts, when they're in place, then we can affect the laws which guide, the rule of law. We can affect the rule of law on every level. And once we've done that, of course, we can impose biblical morality on people, whether they want it or not. Now that a lot of that sounds fine and dandy, but it certainly is far outside of the gospel that was preached by Christ. Look, I remember in the late 1980s, and Pat Robertson was involved with this, and he had a memo to the Iowa Republican County Caucus, and it was being passed around to different select people at that time. It was a memo that was, and you could probably look this up on the internet, I bet you anything that is still in print. It was called How to Participate in a Political Party. And in that memo, he actually wrote, rule the world for God. But here's what he said. Now, he said, give the impression that you are there to work for the party. Don't push your ideology yet. Hide your strength. He actually said that. Don't flaunt your Christianity. Because he said Christians need to get into leadership positions, and especially at the highest level, because party officials control political parties, and so it's important that Christians get into the controlling factions, have a majority of leadership positions wherever it's possible. Well, Derek, besides what at that time started bothering me about the deceptive nature of what we were doing, it misses the point. It doesn't even really matter that it was deceptive. It completely misses the point that the pilgrims, you brought this up either a moment ago or offline in between while we were doing these programs, the pilgrims fled Britain partly to escape that kind of a political system that tried to impose, rules and morality that was defined by a particular sect on the larger population. Many of them didn't even agree with either the politics or the theology. And that is why the framers of the Constitution, once they got here and they fought bloody wars and they died to preserve certain liberties, individual, free-thinking liberties, they fought and they died for it because they believed that it was definitely the model of Christ. It was definitely the model of God himself, who doesn't breach free moral agency. And so they wrote the Constitution, they wrote the Bill of Rights, and they were careful to take steps to protect the individual, whether they're part of the majority or the minority, to protect them from a belief system, from religious mandates being handed down from a federal judiciary whose decisions might either be in support of or against statements of faith. It was actually Thomas Jefferson, by the way, who wrote, and you might remember this because you're a student of history, but he wrote to the Danbury Baptist Association. Right. And they wanted him to use his office as the president to rule in their favor against a particular state law. And he wrote back that he would not do that because there was a wall of separation between church and state. And he wanted them to know that it was important that the federal government not take the position of favoring a particular religious ideology. And under this kind of constitution and bylaws, America has flourished to become the bedrock for all kinds of people, for all kinds of faith, from everything from an atheist to born-again Christians to people that worship a head of lettuce, And it's important that people understand, I am a fundamentalist Christian, but I want the guy who wants to worship a head of lettuce to have the right to do it. And if people don't understand that, Derek, I can't help them.
You mentioned a phrase that really caught my attention, and I want to expand on this and get into your analysis of dominionism and why it's a heresy. You said that it would provide the doormat for the appearance of the Antichrist, that Christians are being duped into welcoming the Antichrist with open arms, basically. Or did I misunderstand?
No, you understood me completely. Look, think back to the darkest days of the Inquisition, other times in history where there has been this marriage between politics and religion. And I mean, think of the worst times. Thomas, Torquemada, people like that, whose cruelty, their fanaticism, actually pretended to be the service of religion. Well, dominionism, in my opinion, satisfies the need of providing a platform for the Antichrist. Because when you read the book of Revelation, it becomes obvious that Antichrist is going to come to power under a marriage of political and religious authority. You have the politician, the Antichrist, who's supported by the religious false prophet, who wins allegiance to the political side from the global church community. And Derek, people need to understand that very soon, now this of course is my opinion, but I believe, and I think most people right now believe, in fact, I think even non-believers believe that in the very near future, a man, a mystical man of superior intellect and wit and charm and diplomacy is going to emerge on the world scene as a savior. This guy is going to seem to possess a transcendent kind of wisdom that has escaped everybody else. He's going to solve the Earth's problems. He's going to solve all of these perplexing issues that the answers of which have escaped the rest of us. His popularity, I think, is going to be completely widespread. Young, old, religious, non-religious, male, female. He is going to be the talk of the town. He's going to be, being interviewed by everybody except you. Everybody's going to be covering this guy's movements. In every human way, he is going to appeal to the best ideas of society. The problem is, he's a political figure, and his profound comprehension and irresistible presence is the result of an invisible network of thousands of years of collective knowledge. This is a guy who is going to be the embodiment of a very old, we wrote about him in our book, The Ariman Gate, a super-intelligent spirit. Just like Jesus was the seed of the woman, this guy is going to be the seed of the serpent, but the broad masses of the world are not going to recognize him as the beast. And this guy is going to be empowered by religious dominionism. And with his imperious decree, he is going to facilitate this one world government, this universal religion, this global socialism that we've been talking about for so long. And everybody that refuses that new world order eventually are going to be imprisoned, and eventually they're going to be destroyed. It wasn't that many years ago when, in fact, during the 1980s, since we've been talking about the 1980s and the rise of dominionism, it was during the 1980s that then President George Bush, who I voted for, pronounced over national television that a new world order had arrived.
Right.
And, of course, he was, talking about the war with Kuwait and all of that. But following that announcement, man, people just started piling up. Political figures, religious figures, everybody jumped on the rhetoric aimed at implementing the goals of a new world order. Well, if people haven't heard anything else that I've said, I hope that they can hear this third installment. At the core of an imminent conspiracy, there is a leader of indescribable brutality that's about to appear.
Okay.
This guy is going to make the combined depravities of Antiochus Epiphanes, Hitler, Stalin, Genghis Khan, all of them look like Pee Wee Herman's Playhouse. The Bible says he's going to raise his fist, speaking great things in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name. And he is going to cause, now this is important, because we're talking about dominionism. He is going to cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed, Revelation 13. Notice, Derek, that this guy has the global political authority to impose a blanket death sentence. He has the authority to do that. That's a political earthly authority. But to impose a death sentence on everybody who does not follow him. But then notice, he has this religious interest. It isn't just politics. He's interested in who people worship.
Right. Now, the interesting thing to me is that many who are part of this dominionist belief system would say, in response to what you just said, I wouldn't go along with that because I would see that that was wrong, and I wouldn't worship the image of the beast. Do you think that they'll be fooled?
Well, I believe that many of them will. Look, I know this on the practical level. I've been doing consulting work. I don't want to mention the denomination, but it is one of the largest evangelical denominations in the world, very much given to the dominionist theology. I've been doing consulting work for them on the side for the last decade. I've done, well, look, I was given the responsibility to try to double the revenue coming into one of their businesses. And not only did I double it, I quadrupled their revenue in 4 years. I raised $370,000 in donated revenue. I built $7 million, according to their own insurance company, of improvements to their capital properties. I took their business, which was valued at about $5 million, and today is valued now at over $30 million. I did that with a small group of, depending on the season, of anywhere from 10 to 35 staff who were working directly for me. I am the executive director of that policy board that's overseeing this project. Now, I said all that to say this. I've been doing that for 8 years. Recently, there was a landslide. This whole side of the mountain fell down onto the property. Ooh. And it did, luckily it hit an older part of the property, but it probably did, at least $150,000 of capital damage, not mentioning the fact that we had to shut down for a little while, so we had some operating losses. I don't want to get, just completely tied up in that story, but here's my point. When that happened, I contacted the state headquarters for this organization, and I sent a memo from the executive director to 230 churches who own this operation, 230 churches. And I asked that they would send some help up to my staff to be able to help that staff digging out from literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tons of debris that came down off the side of this mountain. 10 days later, I waited and waited. We sent a memo to every church, to every pastor, to the state headquarters, to every department of the state headquarters. We picked up the phone and called them and said, please send volunteers to help us with digging out this facility that's owned by you. And 10 days later, Derek, there had not been one call, not one person, not one soul, including nobody from the state office. And finally, I called the state headquarters and I talked to the state superintendent, and I told him that I feared that the organization is becoming Luciferian in that they want what they want when they want it, but when the shoe is on the other foot, they have no interest in you whatsoever. And let me tell you something. When Jesus Christ comes to this earth, read the judgment seat of Christ. I want everybody to read the judgment seat of Christ, because he separates the sheep from the goats. And he says, I was hungry, and you gave me meat. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was sick and in prison, and you visited me. And all of his judgment had to do with a moment in time when a believer had a need. Another believer, who in his opinion was one of the sheep, came and ministered to that person on an interpersonal level. All these other people, isn't it interesting what they say? But didn't we do great and mighty dominionist things in your name? And he says, I never knew you. I never knew you. ever. So what I'm saying to people is, it's one thing, of course, to be politically enthused. There's nothing wrong with it. But it is on the dominionist level, ultimately, a problematic situation that can lead to megalomania. People who would force their righteousness on others. And yet, when given the opportunity to reciprocate in kindness, you can't find them. That's Luciferian. And the whole idea that we could take over our courts and impose our morality on other people, while that sounds, I guess, to some people it sounds noble, or at least to control freaks, it goes against the gentle nature of Christ.
Well, yeah, he said flat out that the Gentiles, the lords of the Gentiles, rule over their fellow men, but it is not to be so among you. And we seem to have forgotten that somewhere along the way.
It goes against free moral agency, too, a line that God himself won't cross. It misappropriates the mission of the church because you cannot legislate morality. Now, I think anybody should understand that concept.
Yeah.
Whereas the preaching of the gospel changes the hearts of men. The disciples turned the world upside down just preaching the liberating gospel message of Christ. Now, if you want to know in your church, where should your resources go? Where should your efforts go? Where should your energies go? Paul says the preaching of the Christ is the power of God unto salvation. That's where your resources, your time, your energy, that's where it ought to go. Now, as an American, if you want to vote, that's fine, do it. But then when you get done pulling the voting lever, go back to church and get back involved with what is truly the work, the mission, the Great Commission of the Church of Jesus Christ, to preach the gospel of Christ. That's what will change the hearts of people. The laws won't change the hearts of people. History has proven that so many times that I'm getting sick of thinking about it.
You're absolutely right about that. And the other thing that really drives me crazy is seeing people who are good, professing Christians bend over backwards to defend behavior that is so un-Christ-like that there shouldn't be any question. For example, the torture of prisoners for information, which is being justified as necessary for national security. And that's just one example. There are many others, and I don't want to go into a political discussion, but right is right and wrong is wrong, and it's pretty easy to tell which is which by comparing actions against Scripture.
Well, actually, Derek, what you've said is highly appropriate because we're talking about what dominionism does. It seeks to marriage the political force with the religious community, and it seeks to do so in such a way that is held out as being the will of God for our lives. But the problem is, it doesn't work. It never did work. It's the antithesis of the New Testament story. It's the antithesis of the gospel. And actually, it even brings a curse, I think, on those who understand it and then continue to knowingly promote it, because Paul said, if you preach another gospel, if you preach a gospel other than that you have received, anybody that does that, let them be anathema maranatha. Let them be accursed at the coming of Christ. And you know why? Because dominionism outright is Luciferian, in that it seeks to rule as God would rule, to stand in the place of God. That's what Lucifer wanted to do.
Exactly. Exactly. That's, apotheosis, become a god oneself. Yeah. And
so look, I don't want anybody to get mad at me. But I think a quote here from Pat Robertson's Dominionist manual, The Kingdom, The Secret Kingdom, is appropriate because I want people to know I'm not making this stuff up, and I want them to know. I want them to know the heartbeat behind this movement. And on page 201, they can read this themselves, of The Secret Kingdom. Pat Robertson puts words in the mouth of God. Now, that's no new revelation, does that? When he's not trying to assassinate somebody.
Yeah.
He said this, page 201, he said, "It is clear that God is saying, I gave man dominion over the earth, but he lost it. Now I desire mature sons." He's speaking in place of God. Mm-hmm. "I desire mature sons and daughters who will, in my name, exercise dominion over the earth and will subdue Satan, the unruly, and the rebellious. Take back my world from those who would loot it and abuse it. Rule as I would," end quote. Mm-hmm. Well, okay, Pat Robertson wants to take the world back from Satan. Okay, that's fine, even though the Scripture tells us that that the world is under his dominion.
Exactly.
But okay, but who's the unruly? And who's the rebellious? Well, if you follow dominionism at all, those are the people who do not follow the law as it is set down by this select group, this hierarchy of religious leaders who determine for the rest of us what is and is not the will of God. Now, this is that statement, by the way. Rule the world as I would rule it, was confirmed as far as what he meant by that. And this is easy for anybody to find in 1986 on the 700 Club. By the way, I was on the 700 Club, but I was on with Kinsley. You notice his distance now. But in any case, and Robertson said this, and this is in the archives, May 1, 1986. He says, "God's plan is for his people, ladies and gentlemen, to take dominion." What is dominion? Well, dominion is lordship. He wants his people to reign and rule with him, but he's waiting for us to extend his dominion. End quote. And then he pretends to speak for God again, and he says this, quote, "And the Lord says, I'm going to let you redeem society." Now, I want to finish this quote in a minute, but think about that. The Lord says, I'm going to let you redeem society.
Yeah.
Derek, when did that happen?
Well, again, that's a different gospel than the one I'm familiar with.
Yeah, I mean, when did that happen? I didn't know that happened. I thought when Jesus came, that was the New Testament.
Yeah, exactly.
Evidently wasn't. Well, okay, anyway, let me go back to my quote. I'm going to let you redeem society. There will be a reformation. We are not going to stand for those coercive utopians in the Supreme Court and in Washington ruling over us anymore. We're not going to stand for it. We are going to say we want freedom in this country and we want power, end quote. So,
that's right. We're going to put our own utopians in power.
So what's the bottom line? How much time do we got?
Oh, a couple minutes here, but we're flexible. We don't have any hard time.
Okay, a couple minutes. Yeah. Let me bring it to an end then. Dominionism, it turns the concept of the invisible and spiritual kingdom of God into a literal political empire that is to be established on earth and by force, if necessary, starting with the United States of America. Forgetting that Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world, the framers of dominionism have a gospel whose purpose is to inspire Christians to enter politics and execute world domination, basically, so that Jesus can return to an earth prepared for his earthly rule by his faithful regents. Now, in my opinion, that's not only heresy, but it's a roadmap to an antichrist kingdom. That's, in my opinion, maybe even now being built. And if we talk about this again ever in the future, Derek, or if somebody wants to research this material, the next step in what you and I have talked about would be to start looking at the doctrines of Machiavelli, Leo Strauss, of course, the current administration, because they'll start finding out that in the halls of academia, which has led to those who are now in power, that there is a doctrine that operates hand in hand with dominionism. And it's a scary doctrine, Derek. And ultimately, it will lead to the fulfillment of the book of Revelation, where those who are under the altar of God in the kingdom of heaven have been beheaded because of their testimony, because of their willingness to follow Christ in spite of what world government tells them they must or must not do.
Yeah, there are days coming that would cause men's hearts to fail within their chests. But we know that that He has seen all of this coming and has warned us in His Word. And the comfort, the bedrock on which we can stand is knowing that our futures are secure. Regardless of what happens in this plane of existence in the years ahead, we know that ultimately the victory's already been secured. And we just wait to see how it's all going to play out.
Well, that's exactly right. And so, like I said, to take the next step, you got to go deeper down the rabbit hole.
Yeah. Well, Tom, we appreciate your analysis and your insight into a topic that I think many Christians aren't even aware of. I know I'm coming late to the party on this. And that's why I was so anxious to talk to you about this after we heard your interview with Steve Quayle a couple of weeks back. So, Tom Horn, the editor of Raiders News Update, a daily read for us, should be for you as well, and author with his wife Nita of the excellent novel, The Ariman Gate. Tom, thank you for being our guest again on P.I.D. Radio, and I hope we can do it again soon.
Well, thank you, Derek. And by the way, not only Raiders News Update, but go to Watchers Magazine every day.
Well, life has really taken some interesting turns since 2006.
It really has. It really has. By the way, at the end of the interview, you probably heard him reference watchermagazine.com. We still own that domain. You and I should probably do something with it.
Yeah, we've hung on to it for a long time. We used to have an online magazine. 17 years ago for a while.
Yeah.
And we kind of let it go, but we've just never let the domain go. We thought, that domain name might be useful again someday. So that might be, not, especially since for the last, my goodness, now, how long have I been doing it? Almost 6 years. I've been putting out monthly articles, which are essentially book excerpts from things that we've published.
Right. Well, I have InDesign and I've laid out magazines before, so it's just takes a little time.
Yeah.
That's all.
Well, we may go back and revisit that.
We might. So check on that now and then. We'll let you know if we start putting something up there. It would only be once a month if we do it. Many of you are probably wondering what the plans are for Tom Horn, whether there will be a memorial or anything like that. We do not know yet. Right now, the family are still raw and grieving and hurting, and they don't want to have to address any of that. So they've been very quiet since announcing his passing. So give them some time. Please don't, sort of ask them questions yet. They will come and announce it when it's ready. And if they give us permission to announce it, we will also announce it. So give them some time and continue to pray for them.
Absolutely. Yeah. Less than 24 hours ago. So this is still very, very early for that kind of thinking.
It is. Tom also looked at things that were going on in Israel, and Israel is sort of, they're busy right now. Yeah. Is a very gentle way to put it. Right.
We obviously are watching the situation because of our planned Israel tour next March 31st through April 9th. I'll be talking with Timothy Alberino later today for this weekend's View from the Bunker. I think it kind of depends. Tim is preparing for an expedition to Peru, so I'm not sure he's going to have time.
He's a busy guy.
Yeah. But as of now, we've not made any plans to reschedule or anything. According to Aaron Lipkin, who is on the ground there, so he's more in tune with what's happening in real time, the sense among Israelis is that the operation in Gaza may take 2 to 3 months.
Right.
But who knows?
Well, we don't know, and we don't know what the Lord's plans are. That's the great thing. He hasn't announced them clearly to us, and neither does the fallen realm know clearly what the Lord's plans are. We do know from Psalm 2 that he laughs with with derision at their plans. So rejoice in that.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as we have some concrete information about next March's tour, and it's late March, so we've got 5 months, I think, between now and then. Derek's counting on his fingers.
About 5 months out. Yep.
Oh, I got it. Yay. Points for me.
Good call.
Well, sometimes I get it right, but not always. So anyway, we'll let you know.
Yeah. Well, that obviously is the least of the things on our minds at this point, but it is obviously, for those of you who've already committed to it, it is something you're concerned about. And the Lipkin tours will be, they understand, as they had to through the COVID lockdowns, they had to send back a lot of deposits.
Right.
So.
And we will just postpone if it looks like March is going to be too early to go over there safely. And trust me, Aaron will never ask his team, his people, his travelers to come into Israel if there's any question that you'll be safe.
Yeah,
he will never put you in peril.
So if you want to get the latest updates, we'll keep that. Aaron actually will keep things updated at the website gilbertsinisrael.com.
He will indeed.
So, well,
regard the barn. Many of you have been wondering about the barn. We will post a video later this week that shows the finished sets.
Yes.
We're nearly there. You may have noticed the 5 and 10 set is up and running.
Yeah, it really looks good. I was just some very subtle touches, some inexpensive LED lights sitting on the floor. Just you don't notice them really, but you notice them when they're not there. It's like, boy, that back wall looks really dark and shadowy. So 5 and 10 is already coming from the barn. I will be setting up computers for video editing out there, so all of my office space will be out there.
And I have my writing room.
You've got a writing room.
Yay, I've got it back.
Wonderful.
I've slowly put into shape. It's still got a ways to go, but I'll be writing in there this week. So thank you for all of you who've been praying for us and who have helped us financially, because we could not do this without you. We stand in that barn and we marvel.
Yeah, it's really, really amazing. Even with, the unfinished aspect of it. I mean, one wall is still just the spray foam insulation.
Yep.
And we still got boxes in the middle of the floor for furniture that needs to be assembled.
We do, but, and I know that the paneling will go up. It'll be finished soon. Our wonderful contractor, David James, and his wife Barbara, they are super busy elsewhere. So we always know that, and he's so good. He'll give us a call and say, "I've got 5 hours.
Yeah, so
Can I come over?
I'll be out there this afternoon." And thank you. So again, thank you for your prayers and for your support. We'll post some new, as you say, some video later this week, some new photos of the new sets. I'll put those up at gilberthouse.org/donate if you want to see those, just to give you an idea of where the set is going. Again, the 5 and 10 set already in use. So, it's just a remarkable thing.
Isn't it?
Because when we started this back in April, it's the local news channel giving us an update.
When we started back in April,
it was still full of excess furniture and
full of stuff.
Yeah. So
most of it got donated. Some of it got sort of trashed because it just wasn't worthy of being rehomed.
Yeah.
We also want to do a shout out to Lynn Shepard, who was good enough to come over and help Derek put together furniture while I was cleaning in the house.
Yeah. Let me just be honest. I would not have been able to put that furniture together by myself.
She is a genius.
She knows her way around a toolbox.
She does indeed. And she can read instructions like nobody's business.
Yeah, which is really good, because we only wound up putting things together and having to take a couple of things apart. Had I been doing it, I would have had to disassemble a lot more to reassemble.
Well, you and I, when we put together a desk back over at the Skywatch TV studios, it was the same thing. We had to redo something, and I think we had to actually force it, because it wasn't going the right way.
Yeah.
It ended up upside down.
We'll have to take that whole section apart, or I could just drill a couple of new holes. Let's go for the new holes.
Let's go over that.
Yeah. But so, Lynn, thank you for your help. That truly, truly been a blessing.
It has been indeed. And, continue to pray for the Horn family.
Amen.
And all of you, we pray for you, because I know many of you are mourning the loss of someone that you just took for granted would always be there for you. We need to remember that there is no guarantee from day to day
Right.
that our loved ones will still be there, that our teachers will still be there, that the generals we've come to rely upon will still be there. Show them your love and appreciation today.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's words of wisdom.
Mm.
Well, tomorrow morning, our Gilbert House Fellowship Bible study. Please join us for that.
Mm-hmm.
And until next time, I'm Derek Gilbert.
I'm Sharon Gilbert. Bye-bye, everybody.
P.I.D. Radio is an outreach of Gilbert House Ministries, released under Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 4.0 International License. Follow us online, PIDradio.com, Twitter @PIDradio, or by downloading our free app, PIDradio.com/app or GilbertHouse.org/app. Join us each week for our Bible study, the Gilbert House Fellowship.